David, look at you standing again. God has been faithful. God has been faithful. But you already knew I would not stay broken forever, didn't you, Kenneth? What are you saying, David? Then explain the black Jeep. Explain Emeka. Explain the loan you took 2 months before my accident.
Play it. Kenneth, what is he talking about?
Kenneth paid me to make it look like an accident. He wanted his brother dead.
Grace had not slept in 19 hours, and still she was on her knees on the cold tiled floor of a one-room flat in Ajegunle, massaging feeling back into legs that no longer answered to their owner. David lay on the narrow bed above her, his eyes fixed on the ceiling fan that turned too slowly to cool anything, his jaw tight with the particular shame of a man who used to carry furniture on his back and now could not carry himself to the toilet without help. 6 months ago, Grace had been the youngest regional director at a bank on Victoria Island, a woman with a company car and a corner office and a wedding date circled in red on a calendar that now gathered dust in a drawer she never opened. 6 months ago, David had been a site supervisor on a construction project in Lekki, broad-shouldered and quick to laugh, the kind of man who called his mother every Sunday without fail. Then came the night that broke both of their lives in half, the black Jeep that appeared out of nowhere on the expressway, the impact that sent his motorcycle spinning into the gutter, the doctors at the teaching hospital who used words like spinal cord and incomplete injury and prognosis uncertain. And when the money ran low and the family gathered to whisper about what should be done with a paralyzed man who could no longer provide for himself, it was Grace who stood up in that hospital corridor and said, "I am not going anywhere." She resigned from the bank on a Tuesday morning, typed the letter with hands that did not shake even though her heart was breaking, and never once told David how much she cried in the stairwell afterward, alone, where he could not see her and worry that his burden was breaking her too. She sold her car within a month. She sold the gold jewelry her late father had given her for her 21st birthday. She moved out of her 3-bedroom apartment in Ikeja and into David's cramped one-room flat because it was cheaper and closer to his physiotherapy sessions. And there she stayed, bathing him each morning before the sun rose properly over the rooftops, cooking on a single burner stove, learning the names of medications she had never heard before, learning to read the particular silence that meant he was in pain but too proud to say so. The early days were the hardest, though Grace rarely admitted it even to herself. There were nights when David refused to eat, turning his face to the wall, telling her through clenched teeth that she was wasting a good life on a useless man. There was the afternoon she returned from the market to find him attempting to drag himself to the window using only his arms, determined to prove something to no one, and the terror she felt watching him strain against a body that would not cooperate was a fear she never described to anyone, not even to him. There was the humiliation of ration, of counting naira notes at the end of each week and realizing there would not be enough for both his medication and proper food, and choosing always his medication first, telling him she had already eaten when her stomach was hollow with hunger. Neighbors began to whisper. Some called her foolish, a beautiful young woman with a banking pedigree, burying herself alive beside a man who would never walk again. Others called her a saint, though Grace never wanted sainthood. She only wanted David, whole or broken, breathing. His family did not stay long enough to learn any of this. His mother visited twice in the first month, dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief, promised to send money that never arrived. His 2 sisters called on his birthday, and then not again. But it was his younger brother Kenneth who unsettled Grace the most. Kenneth, who ran a logistics company in Surulere and drove a Range Rover with tinted windows, who visited exactly 3 times in a year, each time bringing nothing but a bag of oranges and a face arranged into a performance of grief. Kenneth would sit at the edge of the bed and say things like, "God's time is the best," and "we must accept his will." Phrases that sounded like comfort but felt to Grace like a man reading from a script he had memorized rather than one he believed. She noticed things. She noticed how Kenneth's eyes moved around the small flat with something closer to satisfaction than sympathy. She noticed how at their father's memorial service the year before the accident, Kenneth had argued bitterly with David over the family's land in Epe, the land their father had verbally promised to David as the elder son, the land that was never formally signed over on paper. She noticed how whenever she mentioned to Kenneth that David's therapist believed he could regain significant mobility with time, Kenneth's smile would tighten at the corners before he changed the subject to something else entirely. Kenneth's third visit was the one Grace remembered most vividly, the one that planted the first seed of suspicion, though she did not recognize it as such at the time. He had arrived unannounced on a Sunday evening, sat across from David with his oranges balanced on his knee, and asked almost too casually whether anyone had heard from the insurance company about the accident report, whether the police file had been closed, whether David remembered anything at all about the moments before the jeep struck him. David, drowning in his own pain at the time, had noticed nothing strange in the questions. Grace, standing by the stove with her back to them, had noticed everything, though she filed it away as simple morbid curiosity rather than the reconnaissance it truly was. Grace worked odd jobs to keep them afloat, tailoring in the mornings, tutoring neighborhood children in the evenings, selling recharge cards from a small table outside their compound. She watched David sink into a darkness that frightened her more than any of his physical pain, the darkness of a man who believed his life had ended even though his heart still beat, and she refused every single day to let him believe that. She held his hand through nights when he wept from frustration. She argued with him when he tried to push her away, told her to go and marry a whole man, a working man, a man who could give her children without machines and physiotherapists and prayers. She told him every time the same thing. "I did not fall in love with your legs. I fell in love with you." 2 years passed this way. Slowly, painfully, David began to recover feeling in patches, then movement in his toes, then the ability to sit unassisted. Then, on a Tuesday morning that Grace would remember for the rest of her life, the ability to stand, trembling, gripping a walking frame, tears streaming down both their faces as their neighbors gathered at the doorway to witness what the doctors had called nearly impossible. It was exactly then, as word spread through the family that David was recovering and might one day walk fully again, that Kenneth's visits suddenly multiplied. He came weekly now, bringing gifts, offering to pay for an upgraded wheelchair, insisting that David move into a proper apartment that he, Kenneth, would personally finance. Grace, exhausted but not blind, found this generosity curious in a man who barely called during the darkest years. She began, quietly, to ask questions. She spoke to the mechanic who had examined David's crushed motorcycle after the accident, a man named Tunde who walked out of a small yard in Mile 2. And what Tunde told her turned her blood cold. The black jeep involved in the collision had not disappeared randomly into Lagos traffic as everyone assumed. Tunde had seen it before, weeks earlier, parked outside David's worksite on separate occasions, and he recognized the driver, a young man named Emeka who sometimes did odd errands for Kenneth's logistics company. The night Tunde told her about the jeep, Grace walked home along the dark, uneven road from Mile 2 with her hands trembling so badly she could barely hold her phone, replaying every strange visit, every ill-timed question, every gift that arrived only after David began to recover. She thought of Kenneth's face at their father's memorial, red with fury over the Epe land, shouting that David had always been favored simply for being born first, that fairness meant nothing in this family. She thought of the way Kenneth's mother once mentioned offhandedly that Kenneth had taken out a loan against his logistics company just months before the accident, a loan whose purpose he never fully explained. Piece by piece, in the darkness of that long walk home, a picture assembled itself in Grace's mind that she did not want to see. A picture too monstrous to believe, of a man who called himself David's brother. Grace did not confront anyone immediately. She gathered more. She tracked down Emeka through a cousin who worked at the same motor park, and after weeks of careful, frightened persuasion and the quiet promise that she only wanted the truth, not vengeance, Emeka finally broke down and confessed. Kenneth had paid him to stage what should have looked like an accident, believing that with David dead, the disputed land in a pair would pass to Kenneth alone as the only surviving son capable of managing family affairs. Emeka had never meant for David to survive paralyzed. The plan was simpler and far more final. When David lived, broken but alive, Kenneth had been forced into a performance of grief he did not feel, waiting patiently for either David's death or their exhaustion to hand him what he believed he deserved. Grace sat with this knowledge for 3 days before she told David, terrified of what the truth might do to a man still rebuilding his body and his spirit. When she finally spoke, David's reaction was not the rage she expected, but a devastating, quiet grief. The grief of a man realizing that the brother he grew up sharing a room with had tried to erase him from the earth over a piece of land. Together, they made a decision. They would not handle this quietly. They would not let Kenneth disappear into shame's shadows the way his conscience might have preferred. They would expose him completely in front of the entire family and anyone else who needed to see exactly who Kenneth truly was. Grace arranged a family meeting under the pretense of celebrating David's recovery, inviting Kenneth's mother, his sisters, extended relatives from a pair, and carefully positioned outside with a phone recording everything, Emeka himself, who had agreed to tell the truth aloud rather than simply to Grace in private. When Kenneth arrived, smiling, bearing another gift, David stood from his chair without the walking frame for the first time in front of his family, and the room fell into stunned silence before he even spoke a word. David, Kenneth said, his voice catching in what looked to everyone watching like genuine emotion. Look at you. God has been faithful. God has been faithful, David repeated slowly, his eyes never leaving his brother's face. But you already knew I would not stay broken forever, didn't you, Kenneth? That is why you started visiting again the moment I could stand.
Kenneth's smile faltered. What are you saying, David? Then explain the black jeep, David said, and the room went utterly silent. Explain, Emeka. Explain the loan you took out 2 months before my accident. Kenneth's mother rose halfway from her seat, her hand pressed to her chest. Kenneth, what is he talking about? Nothing, Kenneth said quickly, too quickly, his eyes darting towards the door. David, the accident is affecting your mind. You should rest. Then Grace played the recording. Emeka's confession filled the small parlor. Every detail of the staged accident, every naira Kenneth had paid, every conversation about the land in Egbe. Kenneth's face drained of color as his mother's hands flew to her mouth, as his sisters recoiled from him, as the family members who had once respected him began, one by one, to leave his side. The police were called that same evening. Officers arrived to find Kenneth still frozen in the parlor, his gift bag of oranges abandoned on the floor where it had fallen from his hands, his mother sobbing into her wrapper, unable to look at the son she had raised. Kenneth tried briefly to argue that Emeka's recorded confession meant nothing, that a man could say anything under pressure. But when investigators pulled the loan documents from his logistics company and cross-referenced the dates with the timeline of the accident, and when Emeka repeated his confession formally at the station with the same trembling certainty he had shown in the parlor, there was no argument left for Kenneth to make. He was charged with conspiracy to commit murder, and the story spread in Lagos faster than either David or Grace could have imagined, from the family compound in Egbe to the business circles of Surulere to the church congregations that had once prayed loudly for David's recovery without ever lifting a finger to help fund it. Kenneth's logistics company collapsed within weeks as clients severed ties rather than risk association with a man now facing attempted murder charges. His fiancé, a woman from a prominent Ikoyi family who had once proudly worn his ring to every social function, broke off her engagement in a brief, humiliated statement that made its way through Lagos social circles almost as quickly as the original scandal, unwilling to attach her family's name to his. His mother, who had visited David only twice in 2 years, now visited the police station weekly, begging for leniency for one son, while quietly, privately, seeking forgiveness from the other. The land in Ekbe, the very soil Kenneth had been willing to kill for, was signed over entirely and legally to David, its rightful heir, the papers finalized in a lawyer's office in Ikeja, with Grace sitting beside David the entire time, her hand resting steadily on his shoulder. Kenneth awaited trial in a cell far smaller than the mansion he had once dreamed of building on that same disputed soil, and neighbors who once envied his Range Rover and his tailored agbadas now spoke his name only in hushed cautionary tones, a warning to their own children about where greed eventually leads a man. David walked fully 6 months later, not with the swagger of the man he used to be, but with something steadier, something earned through years the ordinary eye could never fully measure. He walked down an aisle decorated simply with white flowers and Ankara fabric, towards Grace, who wore no jewelry because she had sold it all long ago, but who had never once looked more radiant to the guests who gathered to witness a love that poverty, betrayal, and paralysis had failed to break. Old neighbors from Ajegule who once called her foolish now wept openly in the pews, ashamed of every whisper they had ever spoken behind her back. His mother wept through the entire ceremony, this time from a grief that had transformed into gratitude, apologizing quietly afterwards to Grace for every visit she never made, every naira she never sent, every year she left a dying man's care entirely to a woman she barely knew. Grace forgave her, not because the wounds did not matter, but because she understood, more than most, that some people only learn love's true weight after they have nearly lost it, and that holding on to bitterness would only cost her more than it had already taken. David returned to work eventually, not as a supervisor, but as an advocate, speaking to construction companies across Lagos about site safety and about the invisible women like Grace who carry broken men back to wholeness without ever asking for applause or recognition. He often told audiences that the most dangerous accident of his life had not been the one on the expressway, but the one nearly hidden inside his own family, and that survival had taught him to see clearly which people stayed only for what could be gained and which stayed simply because love asked nothing in return. Grace opened a small tailoring shop with a portion of the money from the Ekbe land sale, a shop she named simply Grace and Faithfulness, refusing to let the years of ration and hunger define what came after them. Beneath the signboard she hung a single framed photograph, David's first trembling steps on that unforgettable Tuesday morning, the neighbors gathered at the doorway, the walking frame gripped tight in his shaking hands, the day the darkness finally lost, and the day that proved louder than any courtroom verdict ever could, that some kinds of love simply refused to be broken by greed, silence, or time. If Kenneth had never come back once David started recovering, do you think his secret would have stayed buried forever? Drop your answer below. If this story touched you, please like and subscribe. Share it with someone who needs it today. And drop a comment. We want to hear from you. God bless you.